What if I told you the greatest lie in American history is not about what happened, but about when it began? Before Columbus, before 1492, before the ships and the flags, there were people already here whose story was erased on purpose, not as slaves, not as victims, but as travelers, builders, and witnesses of this land. This is not a theory meant to shock you. This is a history meant to wake you up. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change how you see America, Black history, and the past forever. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. History, as we are taught, often begins with a ship on the horizon, white sails, wooden hulls, a date carved into memory, 1492. But history does not begin with arrivals. It begins with presence. Long before Columbus stepped onto Caribbean sand, long before European maps claimed the world in ink and ambition, the Americas were not empty, and they were not isolated. They were part of a larger human story, one shaped by migration, exploration, trade, and courage. And within that story, there is evidence, often ignored, sometimes dismissed, that people of African origin reached the Americas thousands of years before Columbus. This is not a tale of myth. It is a story of humanity. The ancient world was not cut off. We must first unlearn a modern illusion that ancient people were static, confined, incapable of crossing oceans. They were not. Africans navigated rivers like highways, the Nile, the Niger, the Senegal. They sailed coastlines, read stars, mastered why. Long before Europe emerged from its own isolation, Africa housed advanced civilizations, Nubia, Egypt, Mali, Kush, societies that traded across continents and understood the sea as possibility, not barrier. The Atlantic was not a wall, it was a road. Ocean currents moved predictably from West Africa toward the Americas. A vessel entering those waters does not need conquest, it needs time. And Ime is something ancient people had. Footprints in stone and memory. Across Mesoamerica stand colossal Olmec stone heads, some weighing up to 50 tons. Their faces are unmistakable, broad noses, full lips, distinct cranial features long noted by archaeologists. These monuments predate Columbus by over 2,000 years. The Olmec civilization emerged suddenly, fully formed, with advanced astronomy, architecture, and agriculture. Where did that knowledge come from? Why does it appear without gradual development? Artifacts found in the Americas, African-style metallurgy, inscriptions resembling ancient African scripts, skeletal remains with African cranial features, raise questions that challenge the traditional narrative, not answers that demand belief, but questions that demand honesty, voices carried by wind and water. Early indigenous oral traditions speak of visitors from the East, dark-skinned people who came by sea, traded, taught, and sometimes stayed. West African histories speak of voyages launched long before European contact. One Malian ruler reportedly sent fleets across the Atlantic centuries before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing. These stories were not preserved in Europe. In libraries, they lived in memory, in song, in spoken truth, forms of history long dismissed because they did not wear the clothes of Western academia. But history is not only what is written, it is also what is remembered, why this story was buried. If Africans were present in the Americas before Columbus, then the story of Black people in America changes completely. They are no longer defined by chains. They are no longer introduced as property. They are no longer strangers to the land. They become participants in human civilization, not footnotes in someone else's empire. And that truth was dangerous because the system of slavery required a lie, that Black people had no history, no discovery, no contribution, no claim to dignity on survival. To admit ancient African presence would fracture the moral foundation of conquest and enslavement. And so the story was narrowed, simplified, sanitized. History became convenient, the weight of recognition. This story does not erase indigenous history. It does not deny European exploration. It does not replace one myth with another. It does something far more powerful. It expands history. It restores complexity. It restores the idea that Black people did not arrive in America only in suffering, but also in skill, knowledge, and courage. They crossed oceans not as captives, but as travelers. What this means today: history shapes identity, identity shapes destiny. When Black children are taught that their story begins with bondage, the future feels smaller. But when they learn that their ancestors were explorers, navigators, and contributors to global civilization, the future widens. This is not about rewriting history, it's about finishing it. The truth waits patiently. History does not disappear when ignored, it waits in stone, in bone, in current and wind, in the questions that refuse to go away. And perhaps the most honest thing we can say is this: the story of America did not begin with Columbus, and the story of black people in America did not begin with slavery. It began long before, with footsteps on unfamiliar shores, with hands extended in trade, with eyes lifted toward the same stars that guide us still. History is not owned by those who arrived last. It belongs to all who were here. And now, finally, we are listening long before modern maps drew hard lines bet. Wean continents, before oceans were described as barriers rather than bridges, African people lived in a world defined by movement. The idea that ancient Africans stayed in one place, isolated and inward-looking, is a modern misunderstanding imposed on an ancient reality. Africa was not a silent continent waiting to be discovered. It was alive with trade routes, river highways, coastal navigation, and intellectual exchange. From the earliest periods of human history, Africans understood water not as fear, but as opportunity. The Nile did not simply sustain life, it trained generations in navigation, engineering, and astronomy. To move along its currents required observation of stars, seasonal winds, and celestial rhythms. These skills were not confined to rivers. Along the western coast of Africa, communities faced the vast Atlantic with the same curiosity their ancestors had once shown toward rivers and deserts. Fishing vessels evolved into trading ships, and coastal travel slowly expanded into longer, deliberate voyages guided by experience rather than chance. Ancient African societies possessed sophisticated knowledge of winds and currents. The Canary Current flows naturally the coast of West Africa toward the Caribbean and the Americas, a steady force that even today carries debris across the ocean. This current does not require modern engines or advanced navigation systems. A well-built vessel, guided by seasonal winds, could travel westward with relative consistency. The return journey, aided by the Gulf Stream, was equally possible, creating a natural loop that ancient sailors could learn through observation and repetition. African boat-building traditions were not primitive experiments. Reed boats, wooden ships, and sewn-plank vessels were constructed to withstand long journeys. Archaeological evidence shows that Africans crossed open waters thousands of years ago, including voyages across the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Trade networks connected East ICA to Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia long before European maritime expansion. The Atlantic, then, was not an unimaginable leap, but a logical extension of an already global maritime worldview. The civilizations of Nubia and Egypt recorded journeys that extended far beyond their borders. Ships carried gold, ivory, incense, animals, and people across vast distances. Navigation relied on stellar charts, solar observation, and inherited oral knowledge passed carefully from one generation to the next. This was not accidental travel. It was intentional exploration grounded in practical science. When African sailors looked westward, they did not see an endless void. They saw a horizon that promised land, trade, and knowledge, just as their ancestors had seen when they first ventured down Unfa. Familiar rivers, West Africa in particular, produced powerful maritime states whose influence stretched far beyond the coastline. Empires such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai controlled immense wealth and intellectual capital. Their cities housed scholars, engineers, and navigators who understood mathematics, astronomy, and geography. Oral traditions from this region speak of ambitious expeditions, Lao. Etched into the Atlantic, fleets constructed not for conquest, but for discovery. These stories were preserved not in European archives, but in the memories of griots, whose role was to guard history with precision and reverence. One account describes a ruler who relinquished his throne to explore the Western Ocean, sending ships ahead and following with more. While European historians often dismiss such narratives as legend, the same generosity is rarely denied to Norse sagas or classical myths that later proved grounded in truth. The standard of evidence has never been neutral. African stories were doubted not because they lacked credibility, but because acknowledging them disrupted a narrative that placed exploration exclusively in European hands. Navigation itself was a cultural meant. African sailors read the sea through color, wave pattern, bird migration, and cloud formation. They understood that land announced itself long before it appeared on the horizon. These methods, refined over centuries, did not require compasses or sextants to function effectively. Knowledge was embodied, practiced, and shared through apprenticeship, not written manuals. When later European explorers encountered similar techniques among indigenous peoples of the Americas, they often failed to recognize the possibility of shared or parallel maritime traditions. Ocean crossings do not demand constant contact to be historically significant. A small number of successful voyages, repeated over generations, would be enough to establish contact, exchange, and cultural influence. Seeds, metallurgy techniques, artistic styles, and symbolic systems can travel without mass migration. The presence of African sailors in the ancient Americas would not require armies or colonies, only curiosity, courage, and continuity. Resistance to this idea is not rooted in physics or anthropology, it is rooted in habit. For centuries, global history was written from a single vantage point, one that measured human progress by European timelines and technologies. African achievements were minimized, fragmented, or framed as derivative, despite clear evidence of independent innovation. The image of Africans crossing oceans before Columbus challenges assumptions about who was capable of exploration and who was merely waiting to be found. The Atlantic world did not begin in the 15th century. IT had a prehistory shaped by winds that blew long before flags were planted. African seafaring existed within that deeper timeline, quietly shaping human movement in ways that left traces rather than headlines. These traces survive in currents, in oral memory, in archaeological anomalies, and in the stubborn questions that arise whenever history feels too simple to be true, to imagine ancient AFR. Icon sailor standing at the edge of the Western Ocean is not to indulge in fantasy. It is to recognize a human impulse as old as time itself. People have always wondered what lay beyond the horizon. They have always built vessels, trusted knowledge, and taken risks without guarantees. Africans were no exception to this rule of humanity. They were among its earliest practitioners, shaped by landscapes that demanded resilience, innovation, and vision. When African vessels moved into the Atlantic, they carried more than cargo. They carried languages, cosmologies, technologies, and ways of seeing the world. Contact does not require domination to matter. Even brief encounters can leave lasting imprints, subtle yet persistent, woven into the fabric of distant societies. These imprints are oft and misattributed, misunderstood, or overlooked because they do not align neatly with dominant historical frameworks. The refusal to seriously examine ancient African transoceanic navigation says less about the evidence and more about the discomfort it creates. It unsettles a hierarchy built on discovery narratives that begin with Europe and radiate outward. It insists that black people were not passive subjects of history, but active agents within it, moving across the same oceans later claimed by empires, guided by knowledge refined over generations, propelled by curiosity rather than conquest, leaving behind echoes that still challenge us to look again, listen more carefully, and reconsider what we think we know about the ancient world. The presence of Africans in the Americas before Columbus is not a single claim resting on one artifact or one legend, but a convergence of clues spread across disciplines that rarely speak to one another. Archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, oral tradition, early European accounts, and even biology offer fragments of a larger picture, one that becomes visible only when the assumption of isolation is removed. The Americas were not sealed off from the rest of the world, and Africa was not a distant bystander in human movement. When viewed through this wider lens, the idea of pre-Columbian African presence shifts from radical speculation to a question of scale, frequency, and recognition. Human beings reached the Americas tens of thousands of years ago, crossing harsh environments with limited technology, guided by survival instincts and inherited knowledge. If ancient populations could traverse frozen land bridges and open coastlines, it becomes difficult to argue that later ocean crossings were impossible. By the time complex societies emerged in Africa, humans had already demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for long-distance movement. The question is not whether people could reach the Americas, but why some journeys were remembered while others were erased. Physical evidence has long unsettled the traditional narrative. Skeletal remains found in parts of the Americas display cranial features that do not conform neatly to the categories expected by conventional models of indigenous ancestry. These remains have often been reclassified, reburied, or explained away rather than examined openly. The discomfort surrounding Hem reveals how tightly historical interpretation can cling to expectation rather than inquiry. When remains challenge the assumption of a single, isolated origin story, the response has too often been dismissal instead of investigation. Artifacts raise similar questions. Metallurgical techniques found in ancient American sites resemble methods known in parts of Africa long before European contact. Certain copper alloys, casting practices, and symbolic designs appear without clear local developmental pathways. This does not prove direct contact on its own, but it suggests influence that cannot be explained solely by coincidence. Civilizations do not emerge in isolation from all external stimulus, and similarities across oceans demand attention, not avoidance. Early European explorers and chroniclers recorded encounters that complicate the official timeline. Some described indigenous peoples who spoke of dark-skinned visitors arriving by sea generations earlier. Others reported communities with features that did not align with European expectations of the New World. These observations were often recorded casually, without agenda, before racial hierarchies hardened into doctrine. Later historians, writing within rigid frameworks, found ways to reinterpret or ignore these accounts because they did not fit a clean narrative of discovery. Language, one of humanity's most enduring markers, offers subtle but persistent hints. Linguists have identified words in indigenous American languages that resemble terms found in West African tongues, particularly in areas related to Naviga, Sion, trade, and governance. Language contact does not require conquest or mass migration. Even limited interaction can leave traces that survive long after memory of the encounter fades. These linguistic echoes suggest moments of contact that were absorbed into local cultures rather than recorded in written chronicles. Oral traditions across the Americas speak of arrivals from the east of people who came across the water with unfamiliar knowledge and appearance. These stories are often metaphorical, shaped by time and retelling, but they are consistent. In one crucial detail, contact occurred. Oral history is not inferior to written history, it simply follows different rules of preservation. Where writing fixes events in ink, oral tradition fixes meaning in memory. Dismissing these NTS because they lack European documentation reveals more about historical bias than historical reality. African oral traditions tell corresponding stories of journeys launched westward into the great ocean. These narratives do not frame such voyages as miraculous or accidental, but as deliberate undertakings rooted in curiosity and ambition. The absence of surviving ships or ports does not invalidate these accounts. Wood decays, coastlines change, and history rarely preserves evidence evenly. What survives is often what later societies choose to protect. The sudden emergence of advanced civilizations in parts of the Americas has long puzzled scholars. The Olmec civilization, for example, appears with complex social organization, monumental architecture, and advanced knowledge of astronomy and agriculture, without a clearly traceable developmental arc. While indigenous innovation must be recognized and respected, the possibility of external influence does not diminish local genius. Civilizations grow through exchange as much as invention. Contact does not erase originality, it enriches it. Resistance to the idea of African presence before Columbus is not purely academic. It IES emotional and political weight. For centuries, the story of black people in the Americas has been framed as beginning with enslavement, a narrative that subtly reinforces the idea of rootlessness. To acknowledge pre-Columbian African presence is to assert that black history in the Americas includes agency, movement, and encounter long before bondage. This reframing threatens narratives built to justify inequality. The academic gatekeeping surrounding this topic often relies on narrow definitions of acceptable evidence. Written records are privileged over oral accounts. European sources are elevated over indigenous and African voices. Anomalies are treated as errors rather than invitations to expand understanding. This approach does not protect historical rigor, it limits it. True rigor. R demands the courage to follow evidence even when it disrupts familiar conclusions. Biological evidence adds another layer of complexity. Genetic markers found in some indigenous populations show links that cannot be explained solely by known migration patterns. While genetics alone cannot narrate history, it can signal contact, mixture, and movement that deserve contextual exploration. These endings are often presented cautiously, sometimes buried beneath technical language, reflecting the sensitivity of their implications rather than their insignificance. The absence of large African settlements or empires in the pre-Columbian Americas is often cited as proof against contact, but contact does not require domination. Many historical encounters left no cities, no monuments, no lasting political structures. Yet they reshaped cultures in subtle ways. Trade, shared knowledge, intermarriage, and mutual influence can occur without conquest, leaving behind traces that are easy to overlook and hard to interpret centuries later. The story of pre-Columbian African presence challenges the simplicity of the discovery narrative. It insists that history is not a straight line moving outward from Europe, but a web of interactions stretching across oceans and centuries. It asks us to consider that black people were not merely carried into the Americas by force, but also arrived by choice, skill, and intention, participating in the long human tradition of exploration. This perspective does not deny indigenous sovereignty or European exploration. It situates them within a broader huma. End story, one in which multiple peoples moved, met, and shaped one another long before modern borders and categories existed. Recognizing African presence before Columbus does not close the book on history. It opens chapters that were never fully read, inviting a deeper, more honest engagement with the past that refuses to reduce humanity to a single starting point or a single narrative of arrival. The Olmec civilization rises from the ancient landscape of Mesoamerica like a question carved in stone. Appearing along the Gulf Coast of what is now Mexico around 1500 BCE, it emerges with no clear precursor, already complex, already organized, already capable of feats that would challenge even later societies. Massive ceremonial centers, carefully aligned with astronomical precision, appear fully formed. Agriculture is refined, social hierarchy established, and art rendered with confidence rather than experimentation. This suddenness has long unsettled scholars, not because indigenous peoples were incapable of brilliance, but because civilizations rarely crystallize without long processes of exchange, influence, and accumulated knowledge. Among the most striking legacies of the LMEC are the colossal stone heads. Carved from basalt, hauled over long distances without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, these sculptures weigh up to 50 tons and stand as enduring testaments to technical mastery. Yet it is not only their scale that draws attention, it is their faces, broad noses, full lips, heavy jaws, and cranial proportions that differ noticeably from the stylized features common in later Mesoamerican art. These are not abstract representations. They are portraits, individualized and deliberate, marked by helmets or headgear that suggest status, ritual, or role. For decades, scholars have debated what these faces represent. The dominant explanation insists they depict local rulers, rendered in a style unique to the Olmec. Yet this explanation often stops where deep inquiry might begin. Why this style appears so distinctly and then fades? Why these features are rendered with such consistency across multiple heads found in different locations? Why the artist chose realism rather than symbolism for figures meant to embody power? Art, especially monumental art, is rarely accidental. It communicates identity, authority, and memory. Attempts to explain away the African appearance of the Olmec heads often rely on discomfort rather than evidence. Some argue that the features are exaggerated or coincidental, despite their anatomical coherence. Others suggest they reflect generic human traits, though similar realism is not applied elsewhere in Olmec sculpture. Still others dismiss the discussion entirely, labeling it speculative even when the same field. routinely entertains theories based on far less tangible clues. The Olmec did not exist in isolation. They traded jade, obsidian, rubber, and ceramics across vast distances. Their influence spread deep into Mesoamerica, shaping cultures that followed for centuries. Their religious symbols, artistic motifs, and architectural principles echo through later civilizations such as the Maya and the Aztec. See, influence implies interaction, and interaction implies openness. A society capable of such wide-ranging exchange was not sealed off from the world beyond its horizon. When examining the stone heads, it is essential to consider context rather than assumption. The Olmec heartland lay near the coast, close to rivers that flowed into the Gulf of Mexico. This geography positioned them at a crossroad of maritime and inland movement. If contact occurred across the Atlantic, coastal societies would be the first to encounter it. The presence of monumental portraits resembling people of African descent in such a region invites questions that geography itself encourages. Beyond the stone heads, other Olmec artifacts deepen the mystery: figurines with braided hair, thick lips, and facial structure. Res uncommon in later indigenous art appear alongside representations of people with different physical characteristics. This diversity suggests a society familiar with variation, one that recorded difference rather than smoothing it into uniformity. The Olmec artistic tradition shows an awareness of multiple human types, captured with precision rather than stereotype. Skeptics often argue that definitive African artifacts have been found alongside Olmec remains. But cultural exchange does not always leave clear signatures. Travelers adapt, objects decay, influences blend. If African individuals arrived in small numbers, integrated into local society, and contributed knowledge or leadership, their material culture might not survive in recognizable form. What might endure instead are CES remembered in stone, elevated to status worthy of monumental commemoration. The helmets worn by the colossal heads add another layer of intrigue. They resemble protective gear rather than ceremonial crowns, suggesting roles associated with physical activity, perhaps ritual ball games, warfare, or leadership tied to strength and skill. Some have drawn parallels between these helmets and hedge. Are depicted in African context, though such comparisons are often dismissed before being fully explored. Similarity alone does not prove contact, but consistent patterns across cultures invite examination rather than rejection. Chronology matters. The Olmec civilization predates Columbus by more than 2 millennia. During this period, African societies were already navigating oceans, trading OSS, vast distances, and recording knowledge in forms both written and oral. The possibility that a small number of Africans reached the Americas during this long span is not extraordinary. What is extraordinary is the insistence that such contact could not have happened, despite favorable currents, navigational skill, and historical precedent for long-distance travel. The debate over the Olmec key adds often reveals more about modern anxieties than ancient realities. To acknowledge African features in foundational American monuments is to disrupt a narrative that situates Black presence solely within the context of enslavement. It introduces the possibility that Africans were present not as captives, but as figures of authority remembered with honor and permanence. That implication carries cultural weight far beyond archaeology. It is important to state clearly that recognizing possible African influence does not diminish indigenous achievement. The Olmec were not passive recipients of outside ideas. They were innovators, creators, and shapers of their own world. Contact, if it occurred, would have been absorbed, transformed, and reimagined through local genius. Civilizations grow stronger through interaction, not weaker. Exchange does not erase identity, it refines it. The resistance to this interpretation often rests on the fear of opening historical doors that cannot easily be closed. Once one acknowledges that the ancient world was interconnected in ways previously denied, the entire structure of isolated civilizations begins to shift. The Olmec heads stand as silent witnesses to that interconnectedness, their expressions frozen in time, their meaning still contested, their presence undeniable. Stone does not argue, it waits. It endures centuries of weather, conquest, and reinterpretation without changing its form. The colossal heads remain where they were placed, asking the same question of every generation that studies them. Who were we remembering when we carved these faces, What encounters shaped us before written history claimed authority? What stories were lost when certain possibilities became unacceptable? To engage honestly with the Olmec civilization is to accept uncertainty as part of historical truth. Not every question yields a final answer, but refusing to ask is itself a choice with consequences. The Stoneheads invite inquiry precisely because they do not conform neatly to expectation. They demand a history expansive enough to hold complexity, diversity, and the possibility that the ancient Americas were touched by peoples whose stories have yet to be fully acknowledged, their faces, preserved in basalt long before the world learned to call itself discovered. The suppression of African contributions in historical narratives did no key occur by accident, nor was it the result of a single decision or moment in time. It was a gradual process shaped by power, ideology, and the needs of emerging empires to justify themselves. History, as it came to be written and taught in the modern world, was not merely a record of events, but a tool, one that could elevate some stories while erasing others. In this process, Africa's role in glob. Our civilization was systematically minimized, fragmented, and often denied altogether. When European powers began their expansion across the globe, they required a story that placed them at the center of human progress. Exploration needed pioneers, conquest needed justification, and slavery needed moral cover. To portray Africans as advanced navigators, intellectual contributors, or early partici, pants in global exchange would have disrupted the logic of domination. It was easier and more useful to portray Africa as isolated, backward, and passive, waiting to be shaped by external forces. This worldview hardened over centuries. Early European scholars selectively interpreted classical sources, highlighting references that aligned with their assumptions while ignoring those that challenge them. Ancient writers who described African achievements were reframed as exaggerators or dismissed as unreliable. Meanwhile, European accomplishments were celebrated as objective fact, even when supported by equally fragmentary evidence. This imbalance became embedded in academic tradition, passed down through textbooks, lectures, and institutional authority. Colonialism extended this distort. As European powers occupied African lands, they encountered complex societies with political systems, trade networks, and intellectual traditions. Rather than acknowledge these realities, colonial administrations often reclassified them as primitive or derivative. Indigenous records were destroyed or neglected. Oral traditions were dismissed as folklore rather than history. Knowledge systems that did not resemble European models were deemed inferior by definition. The rise of racial pseudoscience in the 18th and 19th centuries provided a convenient framework to reinforce these ideas. Scholars attempted to rank human populations according to fabricated hierarchies, placing Africans at the bottom. Within this logic, it became impossible for Africans to have been early explorers or contributors to world civilization. Any evidence suggesting otherwise was treated as an anomaly, an error, or a threat to the prevailing order. This mindset shaped archaeology as it developed as a formal discipline. Excavations were conducted with assumptions already in place, and findings were interpreted through those assumptions. When artifacts challenged accepted narratives, they were often reclassified, stored away, or explained through increasingly strained theories. Questions about African influence were discouraged, not because they lacked merit, but because they disrupted the coherence of a story that institutions had invested in maintaining. Education systems reinforced these omissions. Curricula framed African history as beginning with slavery, briefly touching on ancient Egypt while disconnecting it from the rest of Africa. This fragmentatio served a purpose. By isolating African achievements in time and space, they could be treated as exceptions rather than evidence of a broader pattern. The Americas, meanwhile, were taught as empty stages awaiting European arrival, with indigenous histories simplified and African presence erased entirely. The suppression extended beyond academia into popular culture, films, literature, and public. Monuments repeated the same narrow narratives, shaping collective memory. Exploration was depicted as a European endeavor. Discovery was framed as a singular event rather than a process. Black people appeared in history primarily as laborers or victims, rarely as thinkers, travelers, or agents of change. Over time, These images hardened into assumptions that felt natural rather than constructed. Challenging this narrative required confronting institutional authority. Scholars who raised questions about African contributions often faced professional risk. Their work was labeled speculative, biased, or unscientific, even when grounded in evidence comparable to accepted theories. The boundaries of legitimate inquiry were quietly policed, ensuring that certain questions remained marginal rega, regardless of their potential significance. This suppression had consequences beyond historical debate. It shaped identity. When generations of people are taught that their ancestors contributed nothing to human advancement, the damage is psychological as well as intellectual. History becomes a mirror that reflects absence rather than presence. The erasure of African agency in the ancient world, rethink, forced contemporary inequalities by suggesting that dominance was natural rather than constructed. The narrative also distorted understanding of other civilizations. Indigenous American societies were framed as isolated, static, and awaiting contact, rather than as participants in a dynamic world of exchange. This simplification stripped them of complexity while reinforcing European centrality. A history that diminishes one group often diminishes others alongside it. The suppression of African contributions relied heavily on the privileging of written records over other forms of knowledge. Societies that transmitted history orally were deemed unreliable, despite the fact that oral traditions often preserved information with remarkable accuracy. This bias ignored the reality that much of ancient human history predates writing, and that memory, ritual, and storytelling were sophisticated tools of preservation long before ink and paper. Even when new evidence emerged, it was often absorbed into existing frameworks rather than allowed to reshape them. Discoveries that hinted at early transoceanic contact were explained as coincidence or independent development. Explanations that, while possible, were rarely scrutinized with the same intensity as alternative theories. The burden of proof was unevenly applied, reflecting an underlying reluctance to revise foundational assumptions. In recent decades, technology has begun to challenge these barriers. Advances in genetics, satellite imaging, and interdisciplinary research have reopened questions once considered settled. Yet resistance remains. The fear is not merely academic error, but narrative collapse. If the story of human history is more interconnected than previously acknowledged, then many long-held claims about discovery, progress, and superiority must be reconsidered. The suppression of African contributions persists not because evidence is absent, but because recognition requires humility. It demands an admission that history was shaped by choices, that certain voices were amplified while others were silenced. It requires a willingness to listen to sources once dismissed and to revisit conclusions once treated as final. History is not a static record carved in stone. It is a living interpretation, constantly revised as new questions are asked and new perspectives considered. The refusal to acknowledge African contributions to the ancient world reflects a deeper discomfort with shared origins and shared achievement. To confront that discomfort is to move closer to a history that reflects humanity as it was and is, interconnected, curious, and far more complex than the stories we were first told. For centuries, the story of Black history in the Americas has been framed almost entirely through the lens of slavery, as though Black existence on this land began in chains and ended in struggle. This framing did not emerge from truth alone, but from convenience. It allowed a vast and complex human presence to be reduced to a single condition, a single trauma, and a single point of entry. In doing so, it stripped Black people of time, agency, and depth, compressing centuries of humanity into a narrow narrative that could be controlled, taught, and justified. To reframe Black history beyond slavery is not to deny the brutality of bondage or the lasting scars it left. Slavery must be remembered in full, without dilution or comfort. But remembrance is not the same as definition. When suffering becomes the starting point of identity, it overshadows everything that came before and everything that followed. It creates the illusion that Black people arrived in history as victims rather than as participants in the human story. Black history did not begin with forced migration. It began with movement exploration, innovation, and cultural formation long before the modern world took shape. Africans built civilizations, navigated rivers and oceans, developed systems of governance, philosophy, science, and art. These achievements did not vanish when Europeans entered the Atlantic world. They traveled with people, embedded in memory, practice, and worldview, even when stripped of material expression. In the Americas, enslaved Africans did not arrive empty-handed. They carried agriculture, oral knowledge that reshaped economies, spiritual traditions that sustained communities, musical systems that transformed culture, and social structures that preserved dignity under unimaginable pressure. These were not accidental survivals. They were acts of continuity, evidence of a history that could not be erased even by violence. To see enslaved people only as labor is to miss the depth of that they preserved and created. Reframing Black history requires shifting focus from what was done to Black people toward what Black people did, even under constraint. It means recognizing resistance not only in revolts, but in survival, adaptation, and creativity. It means acknowledging that Black presence in the Americas included moments of autonomy, influence, and leadership that existed alongside oppression, sometimes hidden, sometimes brief, but always significant. The idea that Black people have no pre-slavery connection to the Americas reinforces a false sense of foreignness. It positions Black communities as perpetual outsiders, always arriving, never belonging. This perception has shaped policy, culture, and self-understanding. To challenge it is to assert that Black history in Americas is not an interruption, but part of a longer continuum of human movement and settlement. This reframing also alters how freedom is understood. Emancipation is often portrayed as a gift bestowed rather than a condition reclaimed. When Black history is defined solely by enslavement, liberation appears as the beginning of agency. In reality, agency existed even in captivity, expressed through rebellion, negotiation, and the maintenance of identity. Freedom was not introduced. It was PERS. UED remembered and demanded. Education plays a central role in shaping this narrative. When curricula isolate Black history to a few chapters on slavery and civil rights, they suggest that Black contributions are exceptional rather than integral. Students learn to associate Blackness with struggle rather than with thought, innovation, or exploration. This narrow framing affects not only how see Black history, but how Black individuals see themselves within it. Reframing Black history beyond slavery also requires confronting how national myths are constructed. Many societies define themselves through stories of discovery, progress, and exceptionalism. These stories often rely on selective memory, emphasizing triumph while obscuring exploitation, including Black history as a foundational element rather than a marginal one. Challenges these myths and forces a more honest reckoning with the past. The arts have often led this reframing where formal history lagged. Music, literature, and visual expression have preserved narratives that official records ignored. Through rhythm, story, and image, Black artists have asserted continuity, linking ancestral memory to present experience. These cultural expressions are not supplements to history. They are historical records in their own right, encoded differently but no less truthfully. Language itself reflects the limits of traditional framing. Terms like slave, minority, or disadvantaged define Black people by condition rather than by culture or contribution. Reframing history involves choosing language that restores humanity, and agency, recognizing people as more than the systems that sought to contain them. Words shape perception, and perception shapes reality. This broader view of Black history also invites solidarity rather than separation. When Black history is understood as part of global human history, connections emerge with Indigenous histories, with diasporas across continents, and with shared experiences of displacement and resilience. These connections do not erase difference, they contextualize it within a larger human narrative of movement and encounter. The resistance to reframing Black history beyond slavery often stems from fear of complexity. Simpler stories are easier to teach and easier to defend. But simplicity comes at the cost of truth. A history that begins with bondage cannot fully explain the endurance, creativity, and influence that followed. It leaves unanswered questions about how cultures survived, adapted, and reshaped the world around them. Reframing is not about replacing one narrative with another, but about expanding the frame. It is about acknowledging that Black history includes suffering and brilliance, loss and discovery, oppression and agency. It insists that Black people were not merely shaped by history, but shapers of it before, during, and after slavery. When Black history is allowed to extend beyond chains, it reveals a past rich with movement, knowledge, and connection. It challenges assumptions about belonging and origin. It affirms that Black presence in the Americas is not a footnote appended by force, but a chapter written through endurance, creativity, and continuity that stretches across oceans and centuries, demanding recognition not as an exception to history, but as an essential part of it. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.